Hello and welcome to the Flourishing Introvert Talks with me, Jo Rawbone. This is the podcast that celebrates the natural gifts of introverts so that we can flourish in all situations. Episode 255, Using Our Emotional Intelligence. Somewhat surprisingly to me, this episode is starting with a sort of history lesson, so forgive me and I promise I'll explain why I did that in a short while. Later in this episode I'll be getting into why emotional intelligence matters for we introverts, especially if we have career aspirations or intentions of living life to the fullest. So the history. A name we so often associate with emotional intelligence is Daniel Goleman, but you may not know that he wasn't the originator of the concept. It was undoubtedly Goleman who brought the concept to prominence with his book Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ, and I can see why it grabbed attention. These days, the title almost resembles clickbait, as it has the potential to stop people in their tracks with a, "Wait, what? I need to dive into that" moment. Until the publication of his book, it's probably fair to say that many academics and recruiters had largely been focusing on IQ, our cognitive or general intelligence quotient. So here now was a rather radical idea that caught the imagination of business leaders across the world. However, some 5 years earlier, Peter Salovey and John Mayer, professors at Yale and New Hampshire respectively, coined the phrase emotional intelligence, or EI, and in 1990 they presented their 4-branch model that underpins most, if not all, models of EI to this day. Their 4 branches are the ability to perceive emotions, understand emotions, integrate emotions to facilitate thought, and regulate emotions to promote personal growth. But even that's not really the beginning of this particular story. In my years as a leadership and personal development coach and trainer, I remember hearing about the work of Howard Gardner and his theory of multiple intelligences, which was published in 1983. Of the 8 intelligences he proposed at that point, 2 in particular, and I could make a case for a third, were probably the catalyst for the emotional intelligence movement. The 2 I'm thinking about in particular are interpersonal intelligence, where we're able to sense people's feelings and motives, thereby enabling us to interact effectively, and intrapersonal intelligence, our ability to understand ourselves, what we're feeling and what we want. Both of these are crucial for introverts in business, and I could argue crucial for life in general, especially interpersonal skills, as we know that interactions have the ability to drain our batteries in super quick time. And yet we know that in life, as in the workplace, the quality of our communications and effectiveness of interactions impacts so much on success. So why the history lesson? I promised I'd explain, so let me attempt that now. There are a number of useful points that emerge for me in exploring the history. Number 1, typically we introverts like to research in order to understand the origins of an idea or the root of a problem. We're rarely satisfied with a shallow or brief explanation. Number 2, like much theory, it has been added to, critiqued and developed over time. So whilst we have our current understanding, there is usually a point of origin worth noting. This allows us to draw our own conclusions rather than blindly accepting so-called received wisdom. And number 3, the fact that the understanding and practice of EI is still being refined and developed confirms that this is not a flash in the pan or a flavour of the month thing. So I think it's a good idea that we take every opportunity to build our EI skills. We are never the finished article, and we can develop for as long as we choose to. Now, I don't know if any of that justifies me explaining the origins, but it mattered to me, so thank you for staying with me thus far. Now, I did say that I'd share why emotional intelligence matters to we introverts, but I'd go one further than that. I believe that if more people had better developed emotional intelligence, this world would not be in such a state of crisis. This may sound like a bold statement, but one I'm prepared to stand behind. It's why I took exception to the recent-ish post by a Silicon Valley billionaire saying, "Don't bring your whole self to work." Those pale, male, stale business leaders who can't deal with emotions are a clear sign that they lack emotional intelligence. In my day-to-day work, training and coaching in corporate environments, I hear and witness far too many examples of problems caused in part by low emotional intelligence. If we had the ability and motivation to care about how those around us were feeling and be aware of how our behaviour was impacting them, we would experience far more compassionate leadership. And I'm talking both business and global leadership here. I chose to follow the Higgs and Dulowitz model at VI as they had a particular focus on measurable competences in the leadership and organisational performance context. One of their 7 factors is intuitiveness, where we use both emotional and cognitive data to make informed decisions. This means that we bring our intuition, our moral compass, and our personal ethics into our decision-making process. And yes, that may mean we take longer to make important decisions because they will not be solely based on the bottom line. Goleman continues to assert that emotional intelligence is a bigger predictor of success than general or cognitive intelligence. He then went on to talk about the importance of social intelligence, and again, this is where I have found many introverts need to refine their skills. It's all too easy to hide behind our introversion and use our rapidly draining batteries as an excuse for poor interpersonal behaviour. Goleman defines social intelligence as the ability to navigate and manage relationships effectively, including understanding social cues, building rapport, and influencing others positively. It encompasses the skills needed to connect with people, to read their emotions, and to adapt to social contexts. So in my book, it seems that work is needed here too for that Silicon Valley billionaire. Now, I'm not going to deny that this takes effort and energy on our part as introverts, which in my world is why we need to up our skill levels in the areas of social and emotional intelligence. So how do we do that authentically? Here are just a few of the things I've put into practice over the years. Starting with emotional intelligence, the most important thing to do is always be working on self-awareness, as this accounts for more than 50% of EI, according to Goleman. Many of we introverts have a natural tendency towards introspection and thoughtfulness, so we have a firm foundation on which to build our self-awareness. My preference, and I invite you to do similar, is to go in search of actionable feedback and then listen to understand, stay curious and in conversation with the feedback giver. I like to ask probing questions that deepen my understanding and help me develop a meaningful plan of action. There's only so much I can learn about myself from myself. Feedback from others helps me see into my blind spots. Next, I chose to use Viktor Frankl's wisdom to pause. He said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. These pauses provide the necessary space for me to practice emotional regulation, so I'm able to recognise what I'm feeling, naming it where possible, but not reacting immediately. I've shared this before, I know, but that has become so much easier for me since developing my emotional vocabulary using tools like Gloria Wilcox's Wheel of Emotions and Brené Brown's table from Atlas of the Heart. This is not about suppressing or denying emotions, but using them appropriately. I found that greeting my more difficult emotions like an old friend and hosting them at a round table works really well. The better developed my emotional intelligence, especially the ability to recognise emotions in others and self-regulate, the better placed I am to be more socially intelligent. And I do find that this is a development area for many introverts. I consistently hear introverts talking or writing about not being able to make friends, build relationships, or interact with colleagues. Introversion is not the reason for this, but it may be due to social anxiety and a lack of social intelligence. There are two aspects to social intelligence: awareness, so the ability to recognise and understand the emotions, intentions, and needs of others. And the second is facility, or the ability to interact effectively. These are essential life skills, so I strongly suggest we don't use our introversion as an excuse as to why we can't do either of these. And of course, the more we do hide, the stronger the myth gets as people witness our reluctance to interact. We need to set ourselves up for success here by looking ahead and planning, practicing even. This is where our thoughtful analysis skills give us the advantage. Make sure we're pre-charged and have scheduled in recharging time afterwards too. We can continue to play to our preference for quality over quantity and remember that staying calm benefits everyone. Probably the biggest shift required here is to ensure that our limiting and self-limiting beliefs are not robbing us of our ability to interact naturally. I think those three, seeking feedback, using the pause to help with emotional regulation, and ensuring that your thinking is not limiting your abilities, are really good ways to start to move the needle. The great news, as far as I'm concerned, is that both emotional and social intelligence are learned, not fixed qualities. All it takes is for you to have a reason to want to improve and the motivation to make it happen. It's in our gift to do this in true introvert fashion, with calmness, consideration, and a cadence that reinforces our authenticity. As introverts, we love to think that we are so resourceful that we don't need anyone. But the truth, borne out by science, is that as humans we need connection. And for us, that connection needs to be meaningful. I maintain that it's impossible to live a fulfilled or flourishing life without mastering initially emotional intelligence and then social intelligence. One is born of the other, after all. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, then please subscribe, rate us and leave a comment, because we know that that helps other people find the podcast. And if other people find us, other introverts can flourish.
You are listening to an Intentional Media Production podcast.